Hey guys, I went ahead and made this video over the process of the ball bouncing project. It's a pretty easy project, should only take you about maybe 2 hours, probably less honestly. It took me about an hour and 45 minutes. So if you guys are ready, let's get started. Alright, so for the foundation of this project, I created a little track here with 5 hurdles. The ball is going to take 2 jumps on one side and then 3 consecutive jumps on the other. Those last 3 hurdles are of varying sizes to give it some variety. Alright, so with our ball added, we go ahead and start animating. Before you animate, you want to make sure that you freeze your transformations and have your pivot point set. You also want to go in and delete all the history. I usually delete it for all objects before I start animating, even though you only really have to delete it for your main object, which is the ball. Go ahead and name all your objects too before you start animating. It's better than doing it later because you might forget, or it may cause some inconsistencies if you have too many objects with the same name. You may get confused. Alright, we're going to go ahead and assign a shader to our ball. Right click and choose Assign New Material. I like to use Arnold materials and shaders, so go ahead and select AI Standard Surface. I'll use green for the ball. It's pretty easy to see. You can also use other Maya materials. They're fine for most of the projects, but if you're gonna do any type of like serious rendering, I would suggest just using the Arnold materials, because the Maya materials sometimes cause a few errors when it comes to rendering in the Arnold renderer. Alright, so we're gonna go ahead and switch to our animation mode, because we're gonna start animating. First thing you want to do is switch your frames per second to 30 frames per second and make sure they're on 30 frames per second times 1. Here to switch your maximum and minimum animation time to the amount of time you think the animation will take. I assume mine would take 420 seconds because it would take 14 seconds to go through the entire animation. We're going to start by setting our 111 positions, pretty much the beginning and the ends of our bounces. I like to use 1 second for the bounces. Usually the realistic time period usually takes, which is about 30 frames. So it's important to get an aerial view of your animation before you start doing the jumps, just to make sure that everything is on track the way it should be. Obviously mine, the straightaways are pretty good, but on the ends I could round the path there a little. Most likely I'll do that at the end of the project. Alright, we're going to go ahead and set up our squash, since we already have the beginning and the ends of our bounces. You can usually do this later on, but I like to go ahead and do it at the beginning. Make sure and set the scale Y to 0.5 and the scale X and Z to 1.25. Next we're going to set up our height of our peaks. After that we're going to go ahead and set the minimum squash for the top of the peak. I usually do scale Y to 0.8 and scale X and Z to 1.1. Great. So now we got that done, we're going to set our 111s, which are usually 5 frames before and after the peak. That is if you're setting it up 30 frames per second. Great. So this is pretty much what we have so far. Doesn't look bad. We just gotta add the stretch. Great. So what I'm doing here is the beginning of our bounces and the ends are a little too long when it comes to the squash. I want to try to minimize that. So I'm going to add a few frames before the beginning of the bounce and a few frames after the end of the bounce. And just set that to 111 on the scale. Great. It's looking good so far. Let's continue. Great. Next we're going to go ahead and set up the stretch. That's usually 5 seconds before the 111s. Make sure to set your scale Y. I usually set it to 1.5 and set the other two to 0.75. You're going to do that for every single bounce. Looking pretty good so far. Bounces aren't too bad, but obviously the stretch part can be rotated towards the 111s. Alright, so when we do the rotation, go ahead and set up your ghost. It's pretty easy, just go to visual in the animation mode, and then go to ghost. I like to set the max and minimum frames pretty high, mostly because I just want to see how the bounce looks all the way through. Obviously my rotation is pretty easy because I only have to rotate the Z. But if you're doing it at an angle, I would suggest take your time while doing it and use both the top viewport and one of the sides. Alright, so real quick, I just went ahead and turned on Ghost again. I wanted to set the frames even higher. I found it a good way to just get an overview of all your bounces. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and grab our dope sheet and graph editor. You can find those under Windows and then animation editors. I like to stick them at the bottom. You can put them at the sides or just have them as a different window, but put them at the bottom gives ease of access. Alright, so we're going to begin adjusting our rotations in the graph editor. Make sure to select rotate X or whatever rotations that you're going to be using. Make sure to break tangents, and I like to put them at weighted tangents. You can see I'm pulling out the right one a bit, mostly because I want it to give that slingshot effect when it hits the 111s. Now you can adjust these however you want to. Just make sure you look at the bounce while you're doing it. Just make sure you're making the bounce look realistic. That's what you're going to be focusing on when you're doing these rotations. Alright, so we're going to do pretty much the same thing for the second one. Just testing. So for the second stretch of the bounce, you want it to rotate at the last second. You don't want it to rotate too fast at the beginning of the stretch and the rotation. You want it to kind of fall first and then kind of rotate towards the bottom. I also moved the keyframe before it here. If you want to move it without changing the value of the keyframe, just hold Shift and middle mouse drag. Alright, so I went ahead and did the same for the second bounce. Get a little lucky here with the last three bounces. The curves are already kind of where I want them. I just move them a little bit to the right or left using Shift middle mouse drag. Now you can see right here, this keyframe has a point to it instead of a curve. It's causing it to kind of quickly rotate. Best way to fix this is to select it and then go to tangents and select spline. You can also do linear, but spline usually helps the issue better. There's a few others you can try too. Alright, so now we're done with that. We're gonna go ahead and look at our peaks, and we're just gonna give it a little hang time at the top. So the best way to do that would be to just do weighted tangents and pull the tangents out. You're looking for kind of like a hill-esque shape. Alright, so we're going to have a quick look at our animation after we do the graph editor. Just want to make sure the bounces look pretty smooth and realistic. I like to look at it from a side perspective, but if you have odd angles during your animation, it'd probably be best to look at it through perspective view. Bounces look pretty good. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and go into our dope sheet to edit the length of our bounces and our overall animation. Mostly all you're going to do here is move around the keyframes and scale them. Now when you go to scale, just select all the keyframes that you want to scale and press R, and middle mouse drag to scale them. Now obviously, when all is done, it probably won't be the same amount of seconds that you put at originally. I switched it between 420 to 450 several times. I ended up squishing a lot of the keyframes together just to give the ball more speed at certain parts. As you can see here, I'm adjusting the ends to make the ball curve more when it goes around. Alright, so it's looking pretty good. Timing seems pretty much perfect at this point. I don't know if I can get any better than this. I usually like to have the ball slow down at the end and start slow at the beginning. Trying to time it too much at the same speed can get frustrating, so don't worry about that. Just make sure it ends and starts at the same spot. Alright, so we're gonna go ahead and play blast. Just go to playback and go to play blast. Now, go ahead and start. Just set the time to the sequence, and make sure the quality is 100%, and you have AVI instead of image. You want to have video, obviously. And for the coding, just do none. I like to use the render setup for the quality settings, but if you're going to do that, make sure you actually set the quality settings in the ARM renderer. Just open up your render settings and just go to common and set, I like to do HD 1080. You can also do HD 720. Alright, for this end product, I just add a few lights. You don't have to do it unless Brummer specifies on his assignment. When you do the play blast, make sure to turn on motion blur and anti-aliasing. You can usually find those buttons near the lighting and shadow buttons on the toolbar for your panel. Alright, see you guys later.